On March 14th, 1925, the Cleveland Press wrote an article that started with the following: "The ghost of a series of wanton murders, apparently directed at the extermination of a peace-loving and industrious family, today arose from the mud and slime of Hardscrabble to add its ghastly name to Ohio's record of crime. Two purchases of arsenic, both believed to have been by the same person, although the scrawled signatures were different, form the foundation on which Joseph Seymour, county prosecutor, is basing the structure of circumstantial evidence in the case. With the discovery, 2 months after the death of Mr. Fred and Mrs. Fred Ginka, of the two signatures, both for arsenic purchases, and the establishing of arsenic poisoning as the cause of death, the prosecutor believes he has finally found the rift in the cloud of mystery. That the slayer was a woman with a lust for the kill is the first conclusion of Medina County authorities. A modern Borgia, who had so cunningly concealed her moves as to leave no single trace of her path of torture and death. She is believed to have been suffering from a killer complex brought on by a psychopathic irregularity." Welcome to, or welcome back to, the Agatha May Detective Agency. I'm Agatha May, and I'm just pleased as non-poison punch that you're joining me for another episode of Laced. Before we start, I want to mention that I have the bonus video up about our last poisoner, Anjet Lyles, and it's available to all member levels, which coincidentally start at the low price of only $3 per month. Now, on with our story, which begins in the 1880s in Hardscrabble, Ohio. Martha Hazel was born April 18, 1883, in Hardscrabble, Ohio, to Sophia Elizabeth Ginka and her husband Wilhelm Carl Hazel. Her family were farmers, and Martha's childhood was one of mostly only receiving needs and not wants. Hardscrabble was a community in Liverpool Township, which is in Medina County, Ohio, about 30 minutes south of Lake Erie. Its original name was Salt Springs because of all the salt springs in the area. No one really knows for sure how the name got changed to Hardscrabble, but it's thought it's because those who settled there found out how difficult it was to get ahead. In 1906, Martha married a farmer named Albert J. Wise, who owned a 50-acre farm. But Martha's marriage wasn't a happy one. Albert expected Martha to do a lot of the heavy lifting on the farm, even when she was pregnant. This is what Martha later had to say about her marriage, and she starts with why she never wore a wedding ring.
He never believed in 'em. We just got married, and he took me to a 50-acre farm in Hardscrabble to work. Baby right away. A boy. It died. 4 more came. Sure, I loved them, but I never had much time for love. It was work in the fields, and milk the cows, and feed the hens, and plant the gardens, and clean the children, and feed the thrashers, and red up for Sunday.
Red up being a term for tidying the house.
No, I ain't complaining. I was never bright, you know. I worked around in other folks' kitchens when I was a girl, and so when Albert asked me, I said yes. I ain't no hand to complain. I just had my troubles that always go with lovin' and workin' and bearin' children. But the beatin' was sometimes hard to bear. It was harder, though, after he died 3 years ago. Me alone in the house all day. Nothing around me but the wind and the rain and awful stillness.
As a distraction from her unhappy life with Al, Martha developed what some considered to be an odd hobby. She attended funerals. Not just funerals of those she knew either. She would attend any funeral she could get to. Maybe the funerals made her feel better about her own life, well, it could be worse, I could be dead kind of thing. Or maybe she thought she looked really good in black. Perhaps going to funerals was her way of being able to cry out all of her sorrows without anyone asking why she was sad. Her father died in 1919 from uremia caused by prostate cancer. Martha tolerated Albert until 1922 when he suddenly died. Martha was a widow with 4 children, and while maybe not footloose or fancy, she was free of her husband. His death certificate showed that he had died from septicemia, which is blood poisoning, and that he'd cut his hand on a tin of pears 13 days before his death. After Albert's death, Martha's funeral crashing became a little more intense. Not only did she attend funerals of those she never knew, but she would openly and sometimes loudly mourn for those strangers. A year after Albert's death, Martha became infatuated with a farmhand on a neighboring farm. His name was Walter Johns, and almost every account I found of Martha's story states that Walter was much younger than Martha. So I decided to try and find out how much of a cougar Martha really was. So I found an article that mentioned Walter and his children, and this article was written in May of 1925. I looked at the census from 1920 and found Walter and his children. This man was 64 years old. Martha was only 41, so I don't know where the younger man story was introduced, but it definitely stuck around. And we'll talk more about Walter here in a bit and learn why he came to regret ever meeting Martha Wise. For the next year, Martha went on her merry way, making goo-goo eyes at Walter and attending every funeral she could get to. On December 13th, 1924, Martha's mother died suddenly. She was 72 at the time of her death, so no alarms were raised. Her cause of death was listed as mitral insufficiency and an enlarged thyroid. On New Year's Day of 1925, Martha and her extended family had a large dinner to celebrate that consisted of boiled pork and vegetables, which doesn't sound very celebratory to me, but oh well. The next day, the family warmed up the leftovers that had been sitting on the stove since the day before and ate even more boiled pork and veggies. But then numerous members of the family began to get ill. By January 4th, her aunt by marriage, Lillian Ginka, was dead. The cause of the family's illness and Lillian's death was at first thought to be ptomaine poisoning. But when Lillian's husband, Fred, Martha's uncle, died 5 weeks later on February 8th, the doctors knew it was something else. With both parents dead, the children who were too young to fend for themselves were sent to family to live. Their son Herman went to live with Martha. For the next month, life in Hardscrabble went on as usual, but all that changed on March 12th. That is the day that the sheriff's department made the announcement that the Ginka family had been poisoned by arsenic. Soon after Fred died, 2 of his children who had been sick were taken to the hospital for additional testing, and that's when the arsenic was found. The sheriff's department had been investigating the deaths of Fred, Lillian, and Sophia, Martha's mother, ever since. But even though they knew that someone had given the family arsenic, they still didn't know who. But then they were handed a ledger from the local pharmacy, and there on an entry for a purchase of arsenic was a name scribbled but still legible. Martha Wise had purchased the arsenic. Martha was arrested on March 18th, 1925. She was questioned by Sheriff Fred Rochon and his men, but she didn't budge. She kept denying that she'd poisoned anyone. So the sheriff decided to take a different approach. He called in his wife Ethel, who was the matron at the jail, to see if she could wheedle a confession out of Martha. She could, and she did. Sobbing in Ethel's arms, Martha told her, "Oh, God, yes, I did it. The devil told me to. I put it in the water bucket. I put the arsenic in the water bucket. I don't know why I did it, except the devil told me to. I put it in the water bucket at my mother's and at Ginka's." In all, 17 people had been poisoned, with 3 of them dying. By the next day, the headlines were all about Martha and how the devil had made her do it. There were stories that Martha had done it because her hobby of attending funerals is what drove her to kill, that she wasn't getting enough funerals to attend to satiate her, so she decided to make her own. Another story was that she and Walter Johns, the neighbor she thought was the bee's knees, were in the midst of a romance, and Martha's family didn't approve because of his young age and insisted that Martha end the relationship. Since we now know that he wasn't younger than Martha, that part of the story probably isn't true. Perhaps the family didn't approve of the relationship, or Maybe, and more likely, there wasn't a relationship at all. On March 20th, 1925, Martha also confessed to burning a few barns down over the years, as well as stealing jewelry from her neighbors. What's odd is that in a place where the newspaper considered so and so visited Cleveland for the day to be news worth printing, the only mention of the fires were after Martha's confession. And in that article, it's mentioned that Martha had been at the fires and was fighting the blazes harder than any man there. Supposedly, she had set the first fire as revenge because the son of the barn's owner had shot one of her pigs. An eye for an eye, or a barn for a pig in this case. It was posited that perhaps the praise Martha had received for fighting that fire with such fortitude is what caused her to start the other two, that she became addicted to the praise. But I guess after 3 fires, her addiction was satiated because there was no mention of any other fires. Another strange thing is that the fires were never mentioned during Martha's trial, at least not that I could find. Her attorney was trying to prove that Martha was insane, and it seems like he would have brought up the fires and thefts as a way to point to Martha maybe being a little doolally. Martha was indicted for murder on April 7th of that same year. Her trial began on May 5th, and by May 12th, she was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. On May 16th, 1925, Walter Johns was arrested for the murders as well. Yes, Martha's eye candy from across the street had been implicated in the murder. First, it was the devil that made Martha do it, and then it was Walter Johns. Martha told her attorney that Walter had told her that she needed to kill her family so that they could be together. Walter was detained for a few days and was adamant that he had nothing to do with any murders and that he and Martha had never been an item. So on May 20th, he was acquitted of all charges, and he hot-footed it back to Cleveland and never looked back. So Martha Hazel Wise spent the rest of her life at the Marysville Women's Reformatory, where she died at the age of 88 on July 28th, 1971. But what if Martha was innocent? I know, I just gave you all the evidence that showed she wasn't. But what was the evidence really? I've made us a little murder board to look at the evidence that proves Martha is guilty and evidence that shows she might just be innocent. First, there was her confession. Was that the truth? I think we all realize that false confessions are made all the time. It was said that Martha was simple minded. The prosecutor and the coroner both declared that Martha was mentally deficient. The coroner also said she was a moral imbecile, which was once used to describe those with a criminal mind. And the way the confession came about just seemed a little sketchy, and it makes me think that Martha might have been talked into confessing. Here are some quotes from the conversation between Martha and Ethel Rochon, the sheriff's wife. Ethel was quoted as asking, "Don't you hear the raindrops? They are saying to you, you did it. Confess for yourself." Ethel also asked Martha, "Didn't you poison them?" To which Martha replied, "Well, maybe I did." Ethel, "Hadn't you better leave out the maybe?" And then Martha confessed. It just seems a little coerced to me. And I think the "don't you hear the raindrops" bit also speaks to Martha's mind. That's how you would talk to a child or an adult with a childlike mind. Residents of Medina County said that Martha was feeble-minded, adult, a moron. Their words, not mine. So would she have had the cunning to poison the family and then cover it up? An anonymous letter was sent to the prosecutor after Martha's arrest that read, quote, "I just want to make a suggestion. See if you can find out if there was ill feeling between Martha Wise and Lily Ginka. I know something of the treachery of this Martha Hazel Wise and also her craftiness to evade suspicion. She is what you might call a moron. Could it be to get rid of her mother and get the property and of Lily for suspecting her? She claims to have been made sick too, but that may be a lie too." End quote. So this had to have been sent the day that Martha was arrested, and it seems as though it was pointing the prosecutor into a very particular direction. That there was animosity between Martha and her Aunt Lillian, and Martha possibly killed her mother to get her property. But Martha had 4 siblings that would have more than likely shared her mother's estate, so how big was the farm to make a fifth of it worth anything? More importantly, Martha's sister Emma testified during the trial that Martha and her mother were always close. Emma was with their mother when she was dying, and she told Emma that she worried that Martha wouldn't be able to take care of herself. I think that also speaks to Martha's mentality. And before Martha was arrested, there was an article about the family being ill, and Martha was one of those named who had gotten ill at that New Year's family dinner. Did she really have the intelligence to know that she should poison herself enough to be sick, but not enough to off herself? I think the letter could be evidence against, but also for her, as it could have been sent by someone trying to frame her. And in that pharmacy ledger that damned Martha, why were there two entries under her name but signed in different handwriting? The prosecutor himself said that the second signature looked to be the work of a person attempting to disguise their own signature and make it look like the first entry. And the pharmacist testified that that was definitely Martha that had bought arsenic that day. Who signed that second entry using Martha's name and attempting to forge her signature? But the biggest piece of evidence in Martha's defense was her sister in law, Edith Hazel. Edith was married to Martha's brother, Fred Hazel. Yes, another Fred. On the second day of Martha's trial, there was news that Edith had committed suicide. She had attempted hanging herself a couple of other times, but her family found her in time. This time she went into an outbuilding behind the house and used a knife to slit her throat. It was said that she was unbalanced from the loss of her family. But it was also reported that neighbors had accused Edith of being the actual poisoner, and that those accusations affected her so much she ended her own life. Sophia, Martha's mother, had been living with Fred and Edith at the time of her death, and that is supposedly what started the rumors about Edith being the poisoner. Martha's attorney had told reporters earlier in the day that Edith had committed suicide, that Edith had even admitted to several friends that she had poisoned Sophia, Fred, and Lillian. She said she had visions that showed that she had put the arsenic into the water buckets, not Martha. But the authorities wrote that off as being just hallucinations brought on by stress. Edith's husband said that Edith had been mentally ill for a while, and that she suffered a nervous breakdown after Martha confessed, and that she had visions that authorities suspected her as the poisoner. Is that a guilty mind speaking? Because to me, it seems like it could be a guilty mind speaking. One of Edith's neighbors was interviewed, Mrs. Marsh, and she said the opposite was true about Edith, that Edith had never admitted she was the poisoner to her, but instead would almost go into hysterics while denying she had anything to do with the poisoning. And while Fred said his wife had been mentally ill for a long time, Mrs. Marsh said that Edith never showed any symptoms of being mentally unwell until the poisoning investigation was made public. Edith's previous attempts to end her own life also didn't happen until the investigation was made public. There was also a story that Martha and Edith had had a quarrel when Martha was first married, and it was something about Martha's visits to Edith and Fred's home. So was Edith the anonymous letter writer that tried to point towards Martha quarreling with Lillian? And if so, was it a way to distract from their own little spat? Another thing that's just a little weird is that when the water was poisoned at Fred and Edith's house, Sophia was the only one who died or got sick. If Martha had actually put arsenic in the water bucket that was used for drinking, why was Sophia the only one it affected? And when the water was poisoned at the Ginka home on New Year's, everyone there got sick, but there was never any mention about Fred Hazel and Edith being ill. Maybe they just weren't at that dinner. As far as the water bucket being poisoned, would Martha have actually wanted to poison children? From what I've read about her, she doted on her own children, even to the point of being indulgent. They were her only concern when she was incarcerated. She was worried that her children wouldn't be taken care of. That, with her diminished mentality, makes me think that Martha loved children, even ones that weren't her own, and it seems odd that she would have done something to possibly kill them. Martha's neighbors had nice things to say about her. They said that after Albert died, she had sold the farm and bought a smaller place and seemed to be happy tending her garden and raising her children. The only negative thing they said about Martha was that sometimes it was hard for her to tell the truth, that she had a tendency to exaggerate reality. I have seen some claims that Martha murdered her husband, but that was never brought up during her trial, and it doesn't appear that his death was ever even questioned. I think Albert really did die of septicemia brought on by a cut on a tin. In one of the many articles I've read, it indicated that Martha was terrified of blood poisoning after her husband died. I think at the very least, Martha was not given a fair trial. I don't think her confession should have ever been allowed as evidence. And without that, what did they have? That she purchased arsenic? Well, she did, but only once. There was someone else who purchased it and used Martha's name. Was that Edith? And both Martha and Edith had confessed to the murders. So why was Edith's determined to merely be hallucinations that made her think she'd done it, while Martha's coerced confession was believed? So who was the poisoner? Was Martha off her rocker so she killed her mother, aunt, and uncle for no other reason than she was cuckoo nutter puffs? Or was she set up to take the blame for someone else? Was Edith the actual poisoner, and was her suicide because of a mental breakdown or because of guilt? I think there was something rotten in Medina, Ohio back in 1925, and I think maybe the murders were pinned on Martha because the powers that were knew they could talk her into believing she had done it. I also think they knew she didn't have the mental capacity to fight her charges. Martha Hazel Wise might not have actually been guilty, but it's now been 100 years since her trial, and what are we to do about it? Thank you so much for joining me here at the Agatha May Detective Agency for another episode of Laced. Please comment and let me know what you think about Martha's case. Do you think she actually did it, or is there a chance she was innocent? I'll be back soon with more true crime. Until then, stay safe and be happy.